Syria just held its presidential election, and unsurprisingly, Bashar al-Assad won his 4th term, which means he'll be serving another 7 years as the president of the country in what I'm sure was a totally free and fair election. I'm sure that there was no funny business going on, nothing undemocratic taking place. Now, of course, the truth is very different from that. I'm being incredibly sarcastic. But before I get to the details on what went down during this election, I want to be abundantly clear that as an individual who identifies on the left, you can both be against United States intervention or the United States meddling in these types of situations, and also acknowledge when undemocratic behavior takes place. And that certainly is the case in the country of Syria. And I want to make the case for that. I want to provide the receipts, and you can judge for yourselves. So first, let's start off with the fact that not everyone was allowed to vote in this presidential election. So Deutsche Welle reports that not everyone within the country is allowed to vote. The country is home to the world's largest number of displaced people, with millions of domestic refugees in the northwestern province of Idlib and in areas in the east that are outside of the government's control, run by Turkish troops or their proxy militia, and they're the ones who have the say. Now, the Kurdish majority in northern Syria is also excluded from being able to vote in this election. So I'm guessing that played a pretty significant role in the fact that Bashar al-Assad won 95.1% of the vote. 95.1% of the vote. And if you're wondering how Bashar al-Assad found himself in that position of the presidency to begin with, after his father, who was a dictator, died, he took power in 2000 and has been in power ever since. So this facade of democracy in Syria is a complete and utter joke, and it should be absolutely clear to anyone who's paying any attention to this in a good faith effort to understand what's going on. Before I give you more details though, I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to weigh in. Francesca?
Yeah, I mean, you said it perfectly. It sounds like you're someone who can walk and chew gum, Anna. That's pretty big, especially for some on the left to do, sadly. But you know, a lot of people are looking at this election and it's not even news. It's not even news. The news is that he didn't win by 99%, because that's what happens when you kill, maim, displace, and otherwise completely control the opposition. I think there were a couple of candidates who ran against him that he himself may have selected, like many autocrats tend to do, to run against him. The joke being, maybe those candidates even voted for him themselves, right? And so again, I'm not here to say this is legitimate or illegitimate, but it's certainly not democracy. It is, and that's okay. It is not me or like my government's role to at all intervene to create democracy, but sure as hell, there are many Syrians who've lost their lives trying to continue what was the Arab Spring that popped off more than 10 years ago to actually break the Assad stranglehold on the country. And look what has happened since. Right. So it's a shame, and it's also a shame that it's not really big news because we all kind of expected this outcome.
Yes.
Yeah. What's happening right now in Syria is the same thing that's starting to happen in America. What happened in Syria makes just as much sense to me as, let's say, the Electoral College. It makes just as much sense as, let's say, politicians picking voters and voters not picking politicians. We can criticize Syria, and it is worthy of criticism because it is anti-democratic what has happened. However, it is also anti-democratic what is happening right here in the United States. I do believe we should take some lessons from Syria, because if we do not change the course of how we do elections in America, and we continue to allow the right to cherry pick who's in charge of the electoral processes, you're going to end up with a Syria-like election in jurisdictions all across the country, and perhaps even the presidency of the United States.
Yeah, Rashad, you make such a great point, because that really is the foundation of my anti-intervention ideology, because oftentimes what the US government does is try to sell the try to persuade the American people to support intervention by pointing out either a humanitarian crisis or bad behavior by a dictatorial leader and all sorts of issues. But the fact of the matter is, we have our problems within our own borders. We have our problems at our southern border, where we obviously are not treating people in a humane way. Where even in the Biden administration, after he had campaigned about treating migrants with, in a humane way, obviously we've seen images of children still locked in these detention facilities that, of course, are not treating them in a humane way. They're in tight, packed quarters. They're not being given the just bare necessities of living in a decent situation as they're awaiting the government's decision on whether or not they'll be granted asylum. Now, with that said, though, there were other details to this election. And the reason why I'm doing this story is because I do think it's important to set the record straight. I do think it's important for people to know what happened in this election and what the reality is in Syria. Again, you can be against US intervention while also acknowledging that this election was the furthest thing from what you would call democratic. For instance, the government claimed over 18 million eligible voters took part, but because ballots were only offered in areas under government control, only just over 10,000 were actually able to vote, while according to the official results, Assad won over 13 million votes. So there were 18 million eligible voters, but there were ballots given to 13 million. To 10 million, and Assad is claiming that 13 million people voted for him. In essence, more people voted for him than individuals who are actually eligible to vote, given ballots to vote. So the numbers don't make any sense whatsoever. And I also want to just kind of provide some people outside of me who have also weighed in on this issue. Let's go to the next video because it outlines some other inconsistencies and some other issues with this election. Take a look.
President Bashar al-Assad is running against two other men, Abdullah Saloum Abdullah and Mahmoud Ahmad Mari, who stand very little chance of winning. They qualified for the vote after an extremely restrictive process in parliament. All candidates must have the support of 35 members of parliament, which is overwhelmingly dominated by Assad's Ba'athist party. Candidates must have lived in Syria continuously for 10 years, excluding anyone from the diaspora. And they must be married to a Syrian citizen.
President Bashar al-Assad needs this election to legitimize his rule internally and externally, because especially his very strong ally Russia is seeking the rehabilitation of the Assad regime internationally, because Syria lies in ruins. It needs money for reconstruction. So what Vladimir Putin aims at is reconstruction being paid by the West, by the Europeans and the Americans. So they want to put some dynamic into this rehabilitation of the regime by claiming this election to be some kind of democratic, by putting two other candidates there basically, which doesn't make it any more democratic than it used to be without candidates.
Okay, so hopefully you guys caught that. There were two other candidates, but the two other candidates had to be approved by Bashar al-Assad's party. So candidates have to fulfill certain criteria before they're able to submit their candidacy to Syria's Supreme Constitutional Court. They have to be backed by 35 members of parliament, which is dominated by Assad's party. Candidates also need to have lived continuously in Syria for the past 10 years, which excludes opposition figures in exile, and need to be married to a citizen. And also, there were just, I think, obvious examples of fraud, including those casting ballots for Assad voting on multiple occasions. Here's one example, and as the Washington Post reported, regime loyalists documented themselves voting multiple times. And here's the image that I was talking about of the same guy voting in two different places. So it's just, I don't know how widespread that was, but there were clearly examples of it. And look, he was also able to drum up some support and some fear by making some interesting decisions about who he would release from detention. I'll get to those details in just a second, but I do want to also give you guys an opportunity to weigh in again. So Francesca, do you have anything else to add to some of the more, some of the details that just aren't really being talked about at all in regard to this election?
Well, one of the most, I think, cruel parts of this election is that you saw Bashar al-Assad voting in Duma, which is a suburb of Damascus, which was the site of a chemical attack that has been contested by himself, by a lot of state actors and proxies, including Russia, saying, no, over 100 civilians did not die in that attack. They staged the attack on themselves. So just imagine having suffered a chemical attack, losing relatives, and then having the autocrat vote in a so-called pretend democratic election in the very town that your relatives or you died in. I mean, I don't know how more on the nose you can get when it comes to just speaking to how cruel this regime is. And I do want to say, the reporter gave some really good context. Yes, this is about legitimizing him for the future. And yes, this is about rebuilding Syria. It needs to be rebuilt. And for sure, Russia is looking to increase its presence. The Syrian civil war was a proxy war, right? It was a US proxy, Gulf states proxy. Everyone and their mother had a little piece of the Syrian civil war at the expense of the Syrian civilians themselves. So as we look towards reconstruction, you're like, man, what is the role of internationalism right now? What is the role we want the United States to play? For sure, we are against intervention, we're against imperialism, but what is the role? How can we, strengthen the international community so that, we can actually, sideline dictators and promote people who'd agree with democracy, right? But in a diplomatic way, not in an arming rebels kind of way. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. Go ahead, Rashad.
Yeah, so the people in Syria are tired. 10 years civil war, you have reconstruction happening, and then you have this consistent narrative that's adversarial to the people of Syria. Obviously, these individuals did not even carry out the cover up well because they can't do simple math. But that is how brazen it is. They don't care that the numbers don't add up. Nobody's going to truly challenge them. But it shows you, number one, how fragile democracy really is. And number two, it shows you the great illusion of democracy under certain leaders. There's an illusion that is being promoted here. There are people in Syria who actually believe that this man won with over 90% of the vote. And that psychology instills in them a sense that there is nothing that can defeat this individual or the regime he represents. This is a great psychological tool. That 90+%, that was all about instilling an idea in the minds of Syrians. So now, what happens in the international community? Well, America, the reason why we don't want America to get involved really is because they always muck stuff up.
Yes.
That's the real reason.
Yes.
If they actually knew what they were doing, we would happily say America needs to get involved. But how can we get involved when we have allowed our very democracy to be manipulated, attacked, and the shredding of our Constitution happened for 4 years under a de facto dictator known as Donald Trump?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, great points all around. And in regard to what the actual popularity of Bashar al-Assad is, I think that this next video kind of gives you an idea of why people in Syria would want to vote for Bashar al-Assad under the conditions that Syrians are currently living in. Let's watch.
How much support is there for Assad beyond the propaganda that we see?
It is very important to understand that this election is an opportunity for Syrians to prove their loyalty to the regime. And this is important in a dictatorship and in a police state because it gives you security. It could save your life. It could save you from detention. It could bring you some more humanitarian aid. It could bring you a permission by the Secret Service that you need to maybe get back to your own house. So many Syrians use this actually to say that they are on the side of the president, obviously, because they are afraid of being detained or being persecuted.
And I really think that that's something to keep in mind when it comes to the climate in Syria, especially when you see various opponents, whether it's in the media in Syria or just through social media, just civilians saying anything negative, not even about Assad specifically, but about the way the economy is being handled. Those are people who typically do have to deal with the police state, who don't get to speak freely about how they actually feel about how the government is handling things there. And so if voting in favor of Assad is seen as a way of securing your I guess, protection or your freedom in the near future, then that might fuel the decision to go out there and vote for him. And then one final thing I just want to add about it. There's a lot of, I think, intentional misinformation about what went down in this election. And that's the reason why I felt the need to talk about it. And you should just be on the lookout for the various sources that claim that Bashar al-Assad is wonderful, that the election was totally democratic. For instance, there's the international delegation in Syria to observe elections. And so they were on the ground, and the whole purpose of these individuals was to allegedly monitor and then report on how democratic this election was. And of course, the outcome of all this, in their opinion, was that it was wonderful. It was totally democratically done. For instance, they write that we saw nothing to indicate unfairness or coercion in the casting of ballots. During and after the election, we observed huge enthusiasm. It appeared genuine and widespread. For many Syrians, the election represents the imminent ending of the war, the defeat of foreign plots, and hope for the future. They also write that for young people, it encapsulates the first period of relative stability they have experienced in their living memory. Many expressed that they were not simply casting votes for their preferred candidate, but for a sovereign, unified Syria free from imperialist interference. So what is the international delegation to the 2021 Syrian presidential election? Who put this group together? Well, you read into it a little more and you find out that the group that put this whole, international delegation together is the Syrian Solidarity Movement, Syria Solidarity Movement. And they're under this umbrella of something called the Association for Investment in Popular Action Committees. And just to give you an idea of who they are, and you should definitely look into them yourselves, in 2017, the association paid US Representative from Ohio, Dennis Kucinich, $20,000 to attend a conference of the pro-Assad European Center for the Study of Extremism in London. The association has been described as a pro-Assad group. Kucinich then later returned the money after reports of the association's support of Assad. So the group that put this international delegation together, the election monitors essentially, is a pro-Assad group. They get sold to the American people as just this anti-imperialist group, anti-war group. But you gotta look at the individuals in the steering committee for this group, and they're pretty transparently pro-Assad. And so be careful of that type of intentional propaganda meant to bolster Assad as some sort of democratic and popular leader in Syria. That's just not the case.
Yeah, from our paid vacation in Damascus and from our hotel rooms, when we finished the second course of the meal, I looked out the window and things seemed pretty cool, And I just signed my name on the statement about imperialism, yada, 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 continue my free trip to Syria, paid for by Assad. Cool, the word independent should be somewhere in there, and it's not. And so thank you for highlighting this, because it's really important. And one of the casualties of the many casualties of the Syrian civil war, of the many lives lost, one of the casualties has been the truth.
Yep.
And so just try to talk about Syria in a nuanced way on the internet. You'll get called a warmonger. I've been called that, Anna's been called that. Dr. Richey will probably be called that by the end of this segment.
Yeah, and I've been called much worse.
Exactly, there you go. But so one again, and this is sort of where internationalism, you guys, we are told to sort of stay in our lane because if you raise questions about this election, you're a warmonger. And it's complicated, so we kind of bow our heads and we're like, all right, well, I'll let the experts talk about that. Well, the experts don't know what they're doing either. These so-called experts, right? So again, hats off to Anna for just talking about this, and for sure, do your own reading. And also know that sources out of Syria, the same reason they would want to vote for Bashar al-Assad so that they will not have the force of the state, of a militarized police state down on them, is the same reason why they wouldn't want to necessarily speak out to journalists, and why journalism is so hard to do. Independent journalism is so hard to do in Syria, because sources don't want to stick their neck out because they want their lives.
Yeah.
All
right.
And that is fundamental. Having a free press is fundamental to a functioning democracy, or to create a functioning democracy. And if you want to stop that creation, you get rid of a free and independent press. And these guys are so extreme that they're running this whole operation, this whole scam, with the smoothness of a Trump inaugural committee. It's sloppy as hell.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.